I stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom I had shared with Clarence for 20 years, buttoning up my black dress. My hands were shaking just a little, but I noticed it. The funeral home could have provided everything I needed, but I decided I wanted to look dignified at my husband's funeral. Clarence deserved a beautiful send-off. Outside the window, the gray December sky hung heavy over Waynesboro, and light rain pattered on the roof of our house. The very house Clarence had built with his own hands when we got married. The phone rang sharply, breaking the silence. I knew who was calling before I even looked at the screen. Everett. Clarence's son's voice cut through the receiver like a saw through metal. He always spoke that way, as if the world owed him something for the very fact of his existence. Cordelia, Persephone, and I will be there at 3 o'clock. I hope you've got everything organized. Your father deserves a proper funeral. His words sounded like a reproach, even though I had spent 2 days arranging everything exactly as Clarence would have wanted. But to Everett, I always did something wrong, not well enough, or not quite right. Everything is ready, Everett, I replied calmly. The service will begin at 5 in the evening at St. Matthew's Church, as your father wanted. And where will the reception be? At our house. I ordered catering from the same company that catered your father's anniversary 2 years ago. Remember, you liked it then. Everett was silent for a moment, and I could feel him thinking about something. His pauses always meant trouble. In 20 years, I had learned to read this man's character better than he would have liked. Okay, just make sure everything is up to standard. Father was a respected man in Waynesboro, and people will judge us by how we bury him. We can't lose face. As if he had been involved in organizing anything other than criticism and instructions over the phone. In the 2 days since Clarence's death, Everett had never once asked how I was coping with my grief or if I needed help. He only checked to see if I was performing my duties correctly. After Everett hung up, I sat down on the bed and allowed myself a few minutes of silence. The house seemed too big without Clarence. He died the day before yesterday morning of a heart attack right here in the bedroom. He woke up, complained of chest pain, and half an hour later, he was gone. The doctors said it happened quickly. I hope he didn't suffer, although I saw him clutching his heart in his last moments. I got up and went to the window, looking out at the street where the maple trees we had planted in our first year of marriage were growing. Back then, they were thin twigs, but now they were mature trees with thick trunks. Time passed quickly, but some moments stretched out for years. We met in a strange and simple way. I was working as an administrator at Dr. Harris's dental clinic on Main Street, and Clarence came in for a dental appointment. He was 45, and I was 45 too. Both of us were worn out by life. Both of us were lonely and tired of being alone. His wife had died of breast cancer 3 years before we met, and I had divorced my first husband, who believed that alcohol and card games were more important than family and work. Clarence courted me slowly, in a manly, thorough way. He would come to the clinic for no reason, just to talk to me during my lunch break. He brought coffee and sandwiches. He talked about his construction business, how he started with 1 truck and 2 workers, and then built a company that built solid houses throughout the county. He talked about his children, who were in college and rarely visited their father, as if they had important things to do somewhere far away from Waynesboro. I listened to him and understood that this man was tired of being alone. He talked about work, but I could see that he came home to an empty house and ate dinner alone in front of the TV. I could see it because I had lived that way myself after my divorce. 6 months later, he proposed without any drama or fancy words. We were walking in the park behind the church, yellow leaves falling like raindrops, and he stopped near an old bench. Cordelia, I want you to be my wife. I'm happy with you. I don't want to live alone anymore, and I don't think you want that either. I was happy with him too. Clarence turned out to be a man who kept his word and didn't disappear when things got tough. He was as reliable as the houses he built, using the best materials and trusted contractors. When my mother fell ill, he drove me to see her every weekend, even though the old woman never liked him and thought her daughter could do better. But the children gave me the cold shoulder from day one. Everett was 20 at the time, studying business administration at university. Persephone was 16 and finishing school. They looked at me like I was an enemy agent who had invaded their territory and was going to deprive them of their father's inheritance. Everett told his father outright that it was too early to get married, that he should wait until he and his sister had finished their studies. Persephone was more cunning. She simply ignored my existence, talking to her father as if I weren't in the room. When I was cooking dinner, she would walk past the kitchen without even saying hello. When I tried to talk to her about school or friends, she would give one-word answers and quickly find a reason to leave. "They'll get used to it," Clarence would say, putting his arm around my shoulders. "Just give them time. They lost their mother. It's hard for them. But you're a good woman, and they'll understand that." I gave them time, 20 years. They never got used to it. They never understood. Everett grew up to be a man who only showed up at his father's house when he needed money or connections for his career. To expand his business, buy a new car, help with a down payment on a house, get a good job through his father's connections. Clarence always helped, and his son took the help for granted, as if his father was obligated to provide for him his entire life. He never said thank you, never asked about his father's health or his business. He just held out his hand for another check or a request to solve some problem. Persephone was more cunning and dangerous. She learned to play the role of a loving daughter when she needed something. She would come with her husband and 2 children, hug her father, tell him how much she missed him and how rarely they saw each other. The children called their grandfather in sweet voices, and Persephone skillfully steered the conversation toward family difficulties, expensive school for the children, the need for repairs, a broken car, or vacation plans that they could only afford with the help of their grandfather. Clarence always said to me after such visits, beaming with joy, "See, Cordelia, Persephone has changed. She has become a caring mother and daughter. My grandchildren adore me." I didn't answer. Why disappoint a person about their own children? Let him believe that he is loved, not used. But I saw how Persephone counted the minutes until departure, how she hurried the children when they played too long with their grandfather, how her face turned to stone when her father began to tell stories from his youth. The phone rang again. This time it was Persephone. Her voice sounded strainedly polite, as it always did when she spoke to me. "Cordelia, Everett and I wanted to ask about the wreaths. Did you order wreaths from the family?" "Of course. A large wreath with white roses and a ribbon that says, 'From a loving wife.'" "And from the children?" "No, I thought you would order them yourself, as close relatives always do." Persephone sighed dramatically, as she always did when she wanted to show my imperfection or lack of understanding of basic things. "Cordelia, we don't live in Waynesboro. We don't have time to deal with things like that. We don't know the local florists. And people might think we didn't love our father. Of course, they're too busy and important to organize their own father's funeral, but they're concerned enough about what people think to criticize my work." "Okay," I said. "I'll order a wreath from the children, too. And make sure it's big and expensive enough. People pay attention to details like that. Dad knew half the town, and everyone will be watching us bury him." After talking to Persephone, I went down to the kitchen and made strong tea in the very teapot that Clarence's mother had given me before she died. The old woman never loved me, but in the last years of her life, she became more tolerant, seeing that I cared for her son better than his own children did. Outside the window, a light rain was falling, and the gray sky weighed heavily on the roofs of Waynesboro. The weather was perfect for a funeral, dreary, gray, conducive to sad thoughts. I thought about how in a few hours I would no longer be Clarence Braxton's wife. I would simply be Cordelia, a widow living alone in a big house. I thought about how Clarence never complained to me about his children. He said they were busy with their own lives, that it was normal for young people to build careers, raise children, and pursue their interests. But I saw how upset he was when they forgot to wish him a happy birthday or didn't call for weeks. I saw how he waited for their calls in the evenings, keeping the phone next to his chair. I saw how he hoped that Everett would want to continue the family business, but his son chose a job as a manager in a large corporation and moved to North Carolina without even considering his father's offer. Clarence built houses for other families, creating cozy nests where people lived happily and raised children. But his own family scattered, leaving him with a wife whom his children considered a stranger. I was the only one who stayed by his side all these years. I cooked dinner, listened to stories about work and problems with contractors, and drove him to the doctor when he started having heart and blood pressure problems. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and saw a flower delivery man with a huge basket of white lilies and red roses. Mrs. Braxton, condolences from Mr. Braxton's colleagues and partners in the construction business. I placed the basket in the living room next to the other flowers that had been delivered throughout the day. Bouquets from neighbors, former clients, friends from the golf club, church members. People sent flowers and called with their condolences. Clarence was truly a respected man in the city. In 30 years of business, he had built half the new houses in Waynesboro and never once let his clients down, missed a deadline, or skimped on materials. At 4 o'clock, an expensive car pulled up to the house, and Everett and Persephone got out. They entered the house like owners, taking off their coats and looking around critically, as if assessing the property that would soon be theirs. Everett wore an expensive dark suit and looked like a successful businessman from the cover of a magazine. Persephone was impeccably dressed, a black dress, pearl earrings, perfect hair and makeup. "There are too many flowers," Persephone remarked, looking around the living room filled with bouquets and baskets. "It looks too bright for a funeral, too festive." "People are expressing their condolences," I replied. "Your father knew a lot of people in this town. He was respected." "Of course he was," Everett said. "He worked his whole life for this town. Half the houses here were built by his own hands." Everett walked around the house, checking things, looking into rooms he hadn't seen in months. He went into his father's study, looked at the bookshelves, the desk, the safe in the corner. Then he went into the kitchen, opened a few cabinets, looked in the refrigerator. "Where are the documents?" he asked, returning to the living room. "The will, insurance policies, documents for the house and business?" "At your father's lawyer's office, Guilford Renwick. Your father always kept important papers at his office." "We'll meet with him after the funeral," Everett said confidently. "We need to get everything in order as quickly as possible. The business can't be left without management." Their confidence that they now owned everything that belonged to Clarence surprised me with its audacity. They spoke as if I were a temporary guest in this house, not the wife of the man who had lived here for 20 years and put a piece of his soul into every room. Persephone sat down in her father's chair without asking permission and took a notebook out of her purse. She had always been organized, even as a child making to-do lists and vacation plans. Now she looked like a businesswoman who had come to deal with important matters. "Cordelia, we need to discuss tomorrow," she said, clicking her pen. "Who will carry the coffin? Who will give the eulogy? Where will the relatives sit?" I sat down opposite her on the sofa, where I used to spend my evenings with Clarence, reading books or watching TV. Now this place seemed foreign, as if I were a guest in my own home. "The funeral home workers will carry the coffin," I replied. Pastor McLean will give the eulogy. He knew your father for 20 years. As for the seating, no, interrupted Everett, who was standing by the window looking out at the street. Someone from the family should give the eulogy. I'll prepare a speech. Father deserves personal words, not the priest's standard phrases. He turned to me, and I saw cold determination in his eyes. Everett always knew how to take control of a situation, even when no one asked him to. And we'll carry the coffin ourselves. Me, my cousins on my father's side, maybe a couple of Dad's close friends. That's right. Okay, I agreed. As you wish. Persephone wrote something down in her notebook and looked up. About the seating in the church. The first row should be for children and grandchildren, the second for other relatives. You can sit in the third row. I looked at her and couldn't believe what I was hearing. The third row? For a wife who had lived with their father for 20 years. Persephone, I think. Cordelia, Everett said softly but firmly. We understand that you're hurting, but we must observe tradition. Blood relatives sit in the front. That's the custom. Tradition. How convenient to hide behind tradition when you need to put someone in their place. In 20 years, they never once mentioned tradition when their father was paying for their education, cars, houses, vacations. Tradition wasn't important then. Besides, Everett continued, coming closer, we need to talk about the house. There will be a lot of people here after the funeral, and they will need a place to stay. Maybe you should stay in a motel for a couple of days. We'll pay, of course. I felt something hot and angry boiling up inside me. They were suggesting that I move out of my own house on the day of my husband's funeral. This is my house, Everett, and I'm not going anywhere. It's still yours, Persephone said quietly, without looking up from her notebook. But you have to be realistic. Dad left the house to the children. It's logical. You have no right to it. How do you know he left the house to the children? Persephone shrugged. Who else? We are his blood, his legacy. You were just a companion in recent years. A companion. 20 years of marriage, and I was just a companion. The woman who made breakfast every morning, washed his shirts, sat in the hospital when Clarence had his first heart attack 3 years ago. A companion. Everett walked through the living room, looking at the furniture, the paintings on the walls, the antique vases that Clarence and I had bought at auctions. He stopped at each item as if assessing its value. Speaking of the house, he said, touching the frame of a painting Clarence had given me on our 10th wedding anniversary. It needs repairs. The roof leaks, the plumbing is old, and the electrical system needs to be replaced. That will require a lot of investment. The roof doesn't leak, I objected. Clarence replaced it 5 years ago. Well, something needs to be repaired in a house that old. In any case, it will be too much for one woman to maintain such a house. It would be more logical to sell it and buy something smaller. An apartment, for example. Persephone nodded in agreement with her brother. Everett is right. Why do you need such a big house? You're not planning on having guests or family celebrations. Something compact and modern would be better. They discussed my life as if I weren't in the room. They decided where I should live and how I should spend my money. Their confidence that they had the right to control my destiny was both frightening and infuriating. I'll live in my house for as long as I want, I said clearly and slowly, and I won't ask anyone's permission. Everett and Persephone exchanged glances. There was something in their eyes that I didn't like, some kind of secret agreement, a plan they didn't want to talk about openly. Cordelia, Persephone began softly, we don't want to fight, especially on the eve of Dad's funeral. But let's be honest, you have no children, no job, no money of your own. Dad supported you all these years, and now what? Now you need to learn to be independent. We'll help you get on your feet, find a job, rent a place to live. but the house and the business must remain in the family, in the real family. So, for 20 years, I was a fake wife, and my husband created a fake family with me. Interesting logic for people who only showed up at this house when they needed money. I got up and went to the kitchen so I wouldn't say anything I wouldn't want to say. My hands were shaking with anger, but I didn't want to cause a scene on the eve of the funeral. Clarence hated arguments and always asked me not to fight with his children. In the kitchen, I opened the refrigerator and took out the ingredients for dinner. Cooking calmed me down and helped me focus on simple tasks: chopping vegetables, preheating the oven, seasoning the meat. It was getting dark outside, and the yellow light of the kitchen lamp made everything seem even more surreal. Everett came into the kitchen as I was putting the casserole in the oven. "Smells good," he said, looking over my shoulder. "Dad always praised your cooking." Yes, he loved home cooking. "Cordelia, I want you to know that we are not enemies. We just want everything to be fair. Dad worked hard to build what he has. This house, his business, his savings. He wanted to leave it all to his children." "How do you know that? Did he tell you?" Everett paused, searching for the right words. "Not directly, but it's logical. Every man wants to pass on his legacy to his children, his biological children. Blood again. It all boiled down to the fact that I was a stranger in this family, a temporary figure who would soon disappear from their lives. But Clarence never made me feel like a stranger. He called me his wife, his family. He introduced me to his friends as his life partner, not as a nurse or a housekeeper. "Your father loved me," I said without turning around. "And I loved him. 20 years is no joke." "Of course you did. He was a good husband, provided for you, gave you gifts, took you on vacations. But love and inheritance are two different things. Inheritance is a family tradition, a connection between generations." Everett spoke as if he were lecturing on family law, cold, judicious, emotionless. To him, I was an obstacle to his father's money, an inconvenient detail that had to be removed tactfully and civilly. Persephone appeared in the kitchen doorway with a telephone receiver in her hands. "Cordelia, you have a call. Some woman from the flower shop." I picked up the phone and listened to the florist's questions about tomorrow's delivery. When I hung up, Persephone was still standing there, studying the kitchen with her cold blue eyes. "The kitchen needs renovating too," she remarked. "The cabinets are old, the stove is ancient. If the house is going to be sold, you'll need to invest in modernization." "No one is going to sell the house." "Cordelia, you're a smart woman. Why do you need all these problems? It's better to get the money and buy something of your own, something new and comfortable, an apartment in a good neighborhood where you don't have to think about repairs and maintenance." Persephone spoke gently, almost maternally, but there was steel in her voice. She knew how to convince people that her desires coincided with their interests. Everett was straightforward, while his sister was more subtle. "I'll think about it," I said, although there was nothing to think about. In the evening, the three of us had dinner at the large table, where Clarence and I usually sat together. Everett and Persephone talked about the funeral, about the people who would come to say goodbye to my father, about how important it was to make the right impression on the people of Waynesboro. "Dad was a well-known man," Persephone said, cutting a piece of casserole. "Half the city council will be at the funeral. The mayor has promised to say a few words. We need to show that the family honors his memory with dignity. The family." They talked about the family as if I weren't part of it, as if 20 years of marriage were just a misunderstanding that would soon be corrected. After dinner, Persephone washed the dishes. The first time in all the years I'd known her that she had done anything in this house voluntarily. Everett sat in his father's chair and read the newspaper that Clarence had been subscribing to for 30 years. "Where will you sleep?" I asked Persephone. "In Dad's nursery, the same room I lived in when I was in school. Everett will be in his old room. They were going to stay the night, in the house they considered their own. They behaved as if they had returned to their parents' home after a long absence. Late at night, I lay in the bed I had shared with Clarence for 20 years and listened to his children walking around the house, opening cupboards, looking for something, and talking in hushed voices. They were exploring the territory they considered rightfully theirs by birth. I thought about how tomorrow I would bury the man who had been my support, my protection, my reason for living. And after the funeral, I would be left alone with people who had never loved me and now openly showed their contempt. But there was something they didn't know. Clarence was a cautious man who always thought ahead, and I was sure that he had taken better care of me than his children realized. In the morning, the rain tapped insistently and monotonously on the bedroom windows. I woke up early, even though I had slept poorly. All night I had heard Everett and Persephone walking around the house, talking in the hallway, opening and closing doors. They behaved like new owners exploring their property. I got up, put on my robe, and went down to the kitchen. The house was quiet. Clarence's children were still asleep. I made coffee and sat by the window, looking at the gray sky over Waynesboro. Today I buried the husband with whom I had spent the best 20 years of my life. After today, many things would change, and I didn't know what exactly lay ahead of me. At 8 o'clock, Persephone came down to the kitchen in a silk robe and slippers. Her hair was neatly pinned up, her face lightly made up. Even at home, even on the morning of her father's funeral, she looked impeccable. "Good morning," she said, taking yogurt out of the refrigerator. "How did you sleep?" "Fine," I lied. "Coffee's ready if you want some." "Thanks." Persephone poured herself coffee into a cup with roses on it, which Clarence's mother had bought 30 years ago. "We need to talk about today." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "Everett and I discussed the details of the ceremony. We decided it would be better if you came to the church separately from us. We'll take the kids in the car, and you can take a taxi or ask one of the neighbors to give you a ride." "Why separately? We're a family." Persephone took a sip of coffee and looked at me with the expression she had when she had to explain obvious things to a stupid person. "Cordelia, let's be honest. People are coming to say goodbye to Dad, and they expect to see his real family, his children, his grandchildren, those who bear his name and carry on his lineage. I bear his name too. I've been Mrs. Braxton for 20 years. Yes, but it's not the same thing. You took the name when you got married, and we were born with it." Persephone spoke patiently, like a teacher explaining a lesson to a slow learner. "People understand the difference." At that moment, Everett entered the kitchen, already dressed in a black suit. He looked dignified and respectable, like a man accustomed to making important decisions. "What are you talking about?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I'm explaining the plan for today to Cordelia," Persephone replied, "about the ceremony and seating arrangements in the church." Everett nodded approvingly. "Yes, we discussed that last night. Cordelia, I understand that this may seem wrong to you, but we have to think about how it looks from the outside. Your father was a well-known man, and his funeral must be dignified. And what exactly do you find undignified about the wife sitting next to the children of the deceased?" Everett and Persephone exchanged another of those special glances that meant they had an agreement they didn't want to talk about openly. "It's not about unworthiness," Everett said cautiously. "It's about tradition and what's right. Blood relatives sit in the front row. That's the custom everywhere." "Isn't the wife a blood relative?" "The wife is different." Persephone finished her coffee and put the cup in the sink. "Wives can be different. They can get divorced, they can remarry, but children are forever, forever. Children who visited their father 3 times a year and only called when they needed money are forever. But a wife who took care of him every day for 20 years is temporary." "Besides," Everett continued, Our children will be sitting in the front row. Dad's grandchildren. They need space, and the church isn't rubber. How many grandchildren will be coming? 4, 2 of mine, 2 of Persephone's, plus our spouses, plus my sister and me. That makes 8 people in the front row. That's fine. And there's no room for me. There will be, Persephone said softly. There are good seats in the third row. You can see and hear everything from there, too. The third row? They wanted to seat the deceased's wife in the third row at his own funeral. I imagined the faces of people who had known Clarence and me as a married couple for 20 years. What would they think when they saw me in the back rows, like a distant relative or acquaintance? One more thing, Everett said, opening the refrigerator and taking out some orange juice. About the speeches, I'll speak on behalf of the family. I've prepared a nice speech about Dad, his life, and his achievements. You don't have to say anything. Why? Because it might be too emotional. You might cry, get confused, forget your words. It's better when a man speaks. It looks more dignified. Dignified. They were very concerned about how everything looked, but they didn't think at all about how it looked to me. Persephone returned from the bathroom completely ready. A black dress accentuated her slender figure. Her hair was styled in an elegant bun, and her makeup was flawless. She looked like the perfect grieving daughter from the cover of a magazine. Cordelia, what are you going to wear? She asked, giving me an appraising look. I have a black dress. Show me, please. I went up to my bedroom and took out the only black dress I had. Simple, modest, bought for some past sad occasion. Persephone examined it critically. It's too simple, she said, and the color is faded. Don't you have anything more suitable? Suitable for what? For the funeral of an important person. People will pay attention to how the family is dressed. It reflects on the memory of the deceased. Family. Again, she used that word, excluding me from its meaning. Maybe you have something dark blue? Or gray? Persephone suggested. Although black is better, of course. I found a dark blue dress that I had bought for last year's Christmas party at church. Persephone nodded approvingly. That's much better. And don't forget the jewelry. Pearls or something like that. Nothing bright or shiny. She gave me advice on my appearance as if I were a child who didn't know how to dress for an important event. But the most surprising thing was that I obediently followed her recommendations, even though she was a guest in my home. At 10 in the morning, the car Everett had ordered arrived. It was a large black sedan, suitable for a solemn occasion. Clarence's children got into the car with their grandchildren and spouses, and I was told that a separate taxi would pick me up in half an hour. See you at church, Persephone said, kissing me on the cheek for show. And remember the third row. I stood at the window and watched as the car carrying Clarence Braxton's real family drove away to St. Matthew's Church. Then I sat down in my husband's chair and thought that something was wrong, but I didn't know how to fix it. The taxi arrived at 10:30. The driver was an elderly man who knew me and Clarence by sight. My condolences, Mrs. Braxton, he said as I got into the back seat. Mr. Braxton was a good man. He built my daughter's house 5 years ago. He did everything honestly, without cheating. Thank you, Mr. Ratcliffe. Have the children arrived? Yes, they're already at the church. It's good that the family is together in this difficult time. That's important. Mr. Ratcliffe didn't know that the family had decided to exclude me from their ranks. To him, I was still part of the Braxton family, the wife of a respected man who was entitled to condolences and support. St. Matthew's Church was full of people. I entered through the main entrance and saw that the first 2 rows were occupied by relatives and close friends of the family. Everett and Persephone were sitting in the front row with their children, and in the second row were Clarence's uncles and aunts, old friends and neighbors. Everett saw me and nodded toward the third row, where there were several empty seats. I walked over there under the gaze of people who knew me as the wife of the deceased. I saw surprise in their eyes, bewilderment. Why was Mrs. Braxton sitting so far away from the family? Old Mr. Harrington, a neighbor who lived across the street from our house, sat down next to me. Cordelia, dear, he whispered, maybe you should sit closer. There's room in the front row. No, thank you. I'm fine here. Mr. Harrington looked at me with sympathy, but said nothing. He understood that something strange was going on, but he didn't want to interfere in family matters. The service began at 11 o'clock sharp. Pastor McLean spoke of Clarence as a man who had dedicated his life to serving his family and community. He spoke of his honesty, his hard work, his loyalty to his friends. But when he mentioned the family, his gaze lingered on the front row, where the children and grandchildren were sitting, not on me. Then Everett spoke. He spoke beautifully and correctly about what a wonderful father Clarence was, how much he had done for his children, how proud he was of their achievements. He told stories from his childhood and recalled family traditions and holidays. But he never once mentioned that his father had spent the last 20 years of his life with me. People cried, nodded, agreed with every word, and I sat in the third row and listened to stories about a man I didn't seem to know. In Everett's version, Clarence was only a father and grandfather, but not a husband. It was as if 20 years of his life simply did not exist. After Everett's speech, the farewell ceremony began. One by one, people approached the coffin, laid flowers, crossed themselves, and whispered farewells. The first to say goodbye were the relatives in the front row, Clarence's children, grandchildren, brothers, and sisters. Then it was the turn of the second row. I sat in the third row and waited for my turn. I wanted to approach my husband's coffin, place my hand on his folded hands one last time, and tell him what I hadn't had time to say while he was alive. But people were moving slowly, and I knew my turn would not come soon. Suddenly, Everett rose from his seat in the front row and headed toward me. His face was serious and determined. He stopped next to my seat and leaned over to speak more quietly. Cordelia, we need to talk. Please step outside. Now, during the service. It's important. Everett's voice sounded tense, lacking the politeness of yesterday. I got up and followed him to the church exit. People turned around, looking at us in surprise. Persephone was waiting for us in the church vestibule, and she also got up and left the hall. What's the matter? I asked when the three of us were alone in the empty hall. The fact that you're behaving inappropriately, Persephone said quietly but sharply. People are noticing that you're sitting apart from your family and are starting to ask questions. What questions? Why isn't the widow sitting with her children? Why does she look like a stranger? Everett spoke quickly and angrily. It creates the wrong impression. But you were the ones who put me in the third row. We thought you would take the hint and behave modestly, but you're drawing attention to yourself. Persephone nervously fiddled with her purse. Mr. Harrington already asked why you're sitting so far away. Mrs. Caldwell was saying something too. And what did you tell them? That the family has certain traditions, Everett replied. But some people don't understand. They think we treat you badly. It's surprising. They weren't concerned that they actually treated me badly, but that people might think so. Reputation was more important than fairness. And what do you suggest? Everett and Persephone exchanged another glance that signified a premeditated decision. We think it's best for you to leave, Persephone said softly, almost sympathetically. Right now, before the cemetery part starts, say you're not feeling well, that you can't handle it emotionally. You want me to leave my own husband's funeral? Cordelia. Everett put his hand on my shoulder in a protective gesture. Think sensibly. There will be even more people at the cemetery. Journalists from the local newspaper, photographers. If they see a family conflict, it will reflect on Dad's memory. Journalists. My father's memory. They pretended to be concerned about the deceased's reputation, but in reality, they were only thinking about how to get their inheritance without any fuss. I'm not creating any conflict. I just came to say goodbye to my husband. Your presence is already creating conflict, Persephone said more sharply than she had spoken before. People look at us and think we don't respect our father's wife, but we just want everything to be right. Right for whom? For Dad's children. For his real family. Everett took his hand off my shoulder and took a step back. Cordelia, you were a good wife to Dad. No one denies that. But now everything has changed. Changed. In the 2 days since Clarence died, everything has changed so much that I've gone from being his wife to being a stranger whose presence is inappropriate at the funeral. We'll give you money for a taxi home, Persephone offered, opening her purse, and we'll tell people you're not feeling well. It seems natural. What if I don't go? Everett and Persephone's faces hardened simultaneously. Their masks of politeness were finally gone. Then we'll have to ask you not to approach the coffin, Everett said coldly, and not to go to the cemetery. We have the right to control the funeral proceedings as next of kin. You are not worthy of being near our father, Persephone said, and her voice sounded genuinely angry. You were just his last whim, an attempt not to be lonely in his old age. But now he's home with his real family. Home. She spoke of death as a return home, where there was no place for a stepmother whom the children had never accepted. Go away, Cordelia. Everett looked at me as if I were an annoying salesperson who needed to be chased away from the door. Leave now while we're asking nicely. I stood in the lobby of the church where I had married Clarence 20 years ago and listened as his children kicked me out of his funeral. Around us were portraits of pastors who had served in this church for a century, and they had seen scenes like this before. Children who renounced their father's last will for money. All right, I said quietly. I'll leave. The relief on Everett and Persephone's faces was too obvious. They had gotten their way more easily than they had expected. Thank you for your understanding, Persephone said, switching back to polite mode. It's the right decision. I turned toward the door, but at that moment, a tall, gray-haired man in an expensive suit entered the church. Guilford Renwick, Clarence's lawyer. He was carrying a leather briefcase and looked as if he had come on business. Mrs. Braxton, he said to me, I've been looking for you. I need to speak with you and Mr. Braxton's children. About the will. Everett and Persephone instantly tensed. Mr. Renwick, Everett said, we agreed to meet tomorrow at the office after the funeral. Yes, but circumstances have arisen that require immediate discussion. Guilford Renwick looked seriously at Clarence's children, especially considering what I just heard. What did you hear? Persephone asked warily. A conversation about Mrs. Braxton not being allowed to attend her husband's funeral, and that she is allegedly not part of the family. The lawyer opened his briefcase and took out several documents. I think you should know the contents of your father's will right now, before you do something you'll regret later. Everett and Persephone exchanged glances. Something resembling fear appeared in their eyes. Mr. Renwick, Everett began, perhaps it would be better to discuss this tomorrow, in a more relaxed setting. No, the lawyer said firmly. I represent the interests of the late Mr. Braxton, and it is my duty to ensure that his last will and testament is carried out exactly as he wished. What is happening here is contrary to his wishes. Guilford Renwick unfolded the first document and put on his glasses. The Will of Clarence Jerome Braxton, drawn up on August 5, 2023, and certified in my office in the presence of 2 witnesses. August 5, 2023, more than a year ago. Clarence had rewritten his will a year before his death, but he hadn't told anyone about it. Mr. Renwick, Persephone tried to interrupt him. Perhaps we should find a more suitable place. This is a perfectly suitable place. The lawyer looked at her sternly. Especially since you've already started discussing the inheritance right here in the church. He looked at the document again and began to read in a clear, formal voice. I, Clarence Jerome Braxton, being of sound mind and memory, bequeath all my property, including my house, business, bank accounts, and personal belongings, to my beloved wife, Cordelia Ann Braxton. The words hung in the air like thunder in a clear sky. Everett and Persephone stood with their mouths open, unable to believe what they had heard. What? Persephone gasped. In addition, Guilford Renwick continued calmly, Mr. Braxton left the following explanation. I leave nothing to my children, Everett and Persephone, because in the 20 years of my second marriage, they have never shown respect for my wife or accepted her as a member of the family. A person who cannot love my wife cannot love me. Everett's face turned white as chalk. Persephone grabbed the wall to keep from falling. That's impossible, Everett whispered. Dad couldn't have. He could, and he did, the lawyer said firmly. And now I ask you to stop harassing Mrs. Braxton and allow her to say goodbye to her husband with dignity. The silence in the church hall was so thick that all that could be heard was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Everett and Persephone stood like statues, digesting what they had heard. Their faces expressed such shock that it was as if the world had turned upside down in a matter of seconds. Guilford Renwick folded the document and looked at Clarence's children with the expression of a man who had seen such scenes many times in his practice. Gray hair, deep wrinkles around his eyes, the calm confidence of a lawyer who had been dealing with family dramas and inheritance disputes for 30 years. This can't be. Persephone was the first to find her voice. Dad loved us. He couldn't have left us nothing. Your father left a very detailed will, replied the lawyer, taking a few more sheets of paper out of his briefcase. All of his property is listed here. The house on Cypress Street, the construction company Brexton and Sons, 3 bank accounts, stocks, bonds, a $200,000 insurance policy, and personal property. Everything is being transferred to Mrs. Cordelia Brexton. But that's not right, Everett exclaimed, his voice echoing under the high arches of the church hall. We are his children. We have rights. You have the right to a compulsory share, Guilford Renwick explained calmly. But your father exercised his right to dispose of his property as he saw fit. The will was drawn up in full accordance with the law. Persephone moved closer to the lawyer, and I saw her hands trembling. Her perfect hairstyle was slightly disheveled, and red spots appeared on her cheeks. Mr. Renwick, Dad had been ill for the last few years. He had heart problems and was taking medication. Perhaps that affected his ability to make sound decisions. The lawyer looked at her intently. Mrs. Fletcher, your father underwent a medical examination before the will was drawn up. I have a certificate from Dr. Wilkins stating that Clarence Braxton was of sound mind and memory. In addition, 2 independent witnesses were present when the will was drawn up. But you don't understand? Everett began pacing back and forth in the small space of the hall. Cordelia could have influenced him. She lived in the same house with him. She could have pressured him, threatened him, forced him to sign documents. I listened to these accusations and couldn't believe they were talking about me. A woman who had taken care of their father for 20 years, made him breakfast every morning, washed his clothes, sat with him in the hospital during his heart attacks. Everett, I said quietly, I never forced your father to do anything. He made all his own decisions. Of course you'd say that, he snapped at me. You got what you wanted, the house, the money, the business. You played the long game, waited for Dad to die, and got everything. His words hit me like slaps in the face. 20 years of living together, love, and care turned into a cynical scheme for enrichment in their understanding. I loved your father, I said, trying to remain calm. And he loved me. We were happy together. You loved his money, Persephone said sarcastically. It was clear from the beginning that you were hunting for a wealthy widower. Dad was naive. He believed your pretty words. Guilford Renwick raised his hand, calling for silence. Everyone, please calm down. The will is legally valid, certified by a notary, and cannot be contested. Mr. Braxton was fully competent and clearly understood the consequences of his actions. And when exactly did he draw up this will? Everett asked suspiciously. And why didn't we know about it? On August 5th of last year. The lawyer looked at the documents again. Your father came to my office and said he wanted to change his will. He had been thinking about this decision for a long time. What happened on August 5th? Persephone looked at me accusingly. What did you say to him? How did you get him to rewrite the will in your favor? I tried to remember that day, August 5th last year. It was a Friday, I remembered, because we were planning to go to the lake for the weekend. And the night before, August 4th, I said slowly, you came to see my father, all of you, with the children. You asked for money for some kind of investment. So what? Everett asked aggressively. We often discussed business matters with Dad. That evening, you told him that Cordelia was not a member of the family, I continued, recalling the details of that unpleasant conversation. That after his death, she would have to move out of the house because it belonged to his blood relatives. Everett and Persephone's faces changed. They remembered that conversation. Clarence was very upset then, I continued. He said he didn't expect you to treat me that way, and the next day he went to a lawyer. It was just a discussion about the future. Persephone tried to justify herself. We wanted to make sure everything would be distributed fairly. Fairly in your opinion, Guilford Renwick said dryly. But your father had a different idea of fairness. He also left me a letter explaining his decision. The lawyer took an envelope out of his briefcase with the words, "To my children," written in Clarence's handwriting. Would you like me to read it? Yes, I said firmly. I wanted to know what my husband was thinking when he made that decision. Everett and Persephone were silent, but I could see in their eyes that they were afraid of what they were about to hear. Guilford Renwick opened the envelope and unfolded the sheet of paper with Clarence's neat handwriting. Everett and Persephone, if you are listening to this letter, it means that I am no longer here. I want to explain my decision to you, although I understand that you will be angry and blame Cordelia for all mortal sins. I married Cordelia 20 years ago not because I was lonely, but because I loved her. She became my true wife, partner, and friend. She took care of me when I was sick, supported me when I had business problems, and shared my joys and sorrows. You, my children, only appeared in my life when you needed money. In 20 years, you never once invited me to a family dinner just because, without any reason. You never once called to ask about my health without asking for help. You treated me like an ATM and my wife like a temporary nuisance. Cordelia makes my life happy every day. You make it more difficult every time you show up. That's why I'm leaving my estate to the one who truly loves me, not the one who loves my money. The silence after the letter was read was deafening. Persephone cried, making no attempt to hide her tears. Everett stood with a stony face, his fists clenched. That's not true, Persephone cried. We loved Dad. We were just busy with our lives, our jobs, our children. Too busy to visit your father without asking for money? The lawyer asked gently. You don't understand. Everett stepped toward Guilford Renwick. This woman destroyed our family. She turned Dad against us. She worked for 20 years to get the inheritance. Everett, I said wearily, I worked to make your father happy, and he was happy with me. If you had come to see us just once to talk, without asking for money, you would have noticed that. Mr. Renwick. Persephone wiped her tears and tried to pull herself together. We will contest this will. We have a right to a compulsory share of the inheritance. Of course, that is your right, the lawyer agreed. But I must warn you that the process will be long and expensive, and the chances of success are minimal. Your father anticipated this possibility and drew up all the documents very carefully. The sound of an organ came from the church hall. The service was ending, and soon people would begin to leave. Everett and Persephone realized that their family drama could become public knowledge. This isn't over, Everett said quietly but menacingly, looking at me. We'll find a way to prove that the will is invalid. That is your right, Guilford Renwick repeated. But until the will is invalidated, Mrs. Braxton is the sole heir and owner of all the deceased's property. Persephone looked at me with such hatred that I involuntarily stepped back. You think you've won? She hissed. You got the house and the money, but you will never be part of this family. We will not allow you to take the name Braxton. I have been part of this family for 20 years, I replied calmly, and I'll use my husband's name for as long as I want. The door to the church hall opened, and people began to file out. The service was over, and now the procession was to move to the cemetery. Everett and Persephone quickly composed themselves, realizing they needed to play the role of grieving children in front of the public. We'll talk about this later, Everett said as he walked past me toward the exit. It's much more serious than that. Persephone followed her brother without saying a word, but the look she gave me promised war. Guilford Renwick gathered his papers into his briefcase and looked at me with sympathy. Mrs. Braxton, I'm afraid you have some difficult times ahead of you. They won't accept this outcome. I understand, I said, but Clarence made this decision consciously, and I will defend his will. If you need any help, let me know, said the lawyer, handing me his business card. I will represent your interests. People were leaving the church and heading to their cars to drive to the cemetery. I saw Everett and Persephone talking to relatives, explaining something, gesturing in my direction. They had already begun a campaign to discredit the will and my reputation, but now I didn't care. I finally understood that my husband truly loved me and protected me even after his death. The will was his last gift to me and his last lesson to the children, who never learned to appreciate what they had. I returned to the church hall and approached Clarence's coffin. Now no one could stop me from saying goodbye to my husband properly. I placed my hand on his folded hands and whispered, "Thank you, dear, for everything." After the cemetery, I returned home tired and devastated. The ceremony at the cemetery took place in a tense atmosphere. Everett and Persephone stood on one side of the grave, I on the other, and between us lay an invisible boundary that no one wanted to cross. People felt the tension, exchanged glances, whispered, but no one dared to ask direct questions about the family conflict. The house was ready to receive guests. The tables were covered with white tablecloths, food was arranged on trays, and flowers from the church were brought into the living room. I changed into a more comfortable dress and began to greet the people who had come to remember Clarence. Neighbors, business associates, friends, members of the church community, all those who knew my husband as an honest man and a good friend. Everett and Persephone also changed their clothes and played the role of hospitable hosts. They thanked people for their condolences, told stories about my father, and accepted bouquets and gifts, but I could see them watching me, waiting for a moment when they could talk to me alone. Mr. Caldwell, who had been friends with Clarence for over 30 years, approached me with a plate of snacks. "Cordelia, dear, how are you holding up?" he asked sympathetically. I know how close you and Clarence were. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. It's hard, but I'm coping. Clarence often spoke of you with such love, the old man continued. He said you gave him a second youth, made him happy again after Elizabeth's death. Elizabeth was Clarence's first wife, the mother of Everett and Persephone. I was never jealous of her. I understood that she was part of my husband's past life, an important and significant part. But the children saw my marriage to their father as a betrayal of their mother's memory. He was a good husband, I replied. We were happy together. Everyone could see that, Mr. Caldwell nodded. What about the children? Do they support you in this difficult time? I looked at Everett, who was talking to a group of my father's business partners, and at Persephone, who was receiving condolences from the ladies of the church. We have a complicated relationship, I replied cautiously, but we try to be civil. Mr. Caldwell shook his head understandingly. Adult children are not always ready to accept their father's new love. That's natural, but time heals. They will understand that he needed you. If only he knew what he was talking about. Time did not heal the relationship with my stepsons, but only made it colder and more hostile. In 20 years, they still hadn't learned to see me as a person, not a competitor in the fight for their father's love. Gradually, the guests began to leave. By 7 o'clock in the evening, only close relatives and a few of Clarence's old friends remained in the house. Everett and Persephone helped clear the tables, wash the dishes, and pack up the gifts. They behaved like caring children helping their mother cope with a difficult day. The last guest left at 7:30. The three of us remained in the house, which had become a battlefield for the inheritance. Everett closed the front door and turned to me with an expression that did not bode well. Now we can talk calmly, he said, taking off his jacket and hanging it on the back of a chair, without prying ears. Persephone sat down in her father's chair and took the notebook she had used to write down yesterday's plans out of her purse. Cordelia, we want to understand what happened, she began in the tone of an investigator conducting an interrogation. How did Dad leave you his entire inheritance? What did you say to him? How did you convince him? I didn't persuade him of anything, I replied, sitting down on the sofa opposite. Your father made that decision himself after your last visit. You mean that conversation in August? Everett sat down next to his sister, and now they sat in front of me, like judges in a courtroom. We were just discussing practical matters. What would happen to the house and the business after his death? You told him that I had no right to inherit the Braxton family property, I reminded them, that the house should remain with blood relatives and that I would have to find myself another place to live. And what's wrong with that? Persephone asked sharply. We were telling the truth. This house was built by our grandfather. Everett and I grew up in it. And our children should grow up here. And you're just a wife, a temporary wife, a temporary wife. After 20 years of marriage, they still considered me a temporary presence in my father's life. Your father didn't consider me temporary, I said calmly. He considered me family, the only family who cared about him. We cared, Everett flared up. We called, we visited, we took an interest in his affairs. You came when you needed money, and you called for the same reason. That's not true. It's true, and you know it. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where the evening lights were coming on. You've visited your father 11 times in the last 5 years. I counted. And every time you left with a check or a promise of financial assistance. Everett and Persephone fell silent. They didn't expect me to keep such accurate statistics of their visits. 11 times in 5 years, I continued, turning to them. That's just over twice a year. Do you know how many times your father has been in the hospital with heart attacks during those 5 years? How many? Persephone asked quietly. 7 times. And not once did any of you come to visit him in the hospital. Not once. I sat next to him alone, holding his hand, while the doctors said the outcome was unpredictable. The stepchildren's faces changed. Something like shame appeared in their eyes, but they quickly suppressed that feeling. We didn't know it was that serious. Persephone tried to justify herself. Dad didn't tell us about his hospitalization. He didn't tell you because he knew you wouldn't come. You're too busy with your own lives to spend time on your sick father. We live in different states, Everett objected. We have jobs, families, commitments. We can't check on Dad every day. But you can come when you need money for a new car or home repairs, I remarked. Then the distance doesn't seem so great. Persephone stood up and began pacing the room, nervously fiddling with her pearl earrings. Okay, maybe we didn't visit Dad as often as we should have, but that doesn't mean we didn't love him. We just expressed our love in a different way. How exactly? We achieved success in life. We built careers, started families, raised children. We made Dad proud. Persephone spoke emotionally, waving her arms. That's also a way of expressing love. Dad achieved your success with his money, I said harshly. He paid for your college education, the down payments on your houses, the startup capital for your businesses, and then you used that success as an excuse to forget about him. Everett turned sharply to me. You have no right to lecture us. You don't know what it's like to be the child of divorced parents, to lose your mother as a teenager, to see your father marry another woman. Your parents didn't divorce, I countered. Your mother died of cancer, and I never tried to replace her for you. But you took her place, Persephone shouted. You took her place in the house, in bed, in Dad's heart, and now you want to take her place in the family history. I didn't take anyone's place. I created my own. Your father loved your mother, and he loved me. These are different kinds of love for different people at different times in life. Don't philosophize, Everett barked. The fact remains, you received an inheritance that should have gone to us, and we won't let you dispose of it so easily. What exactly are you going to do? Everett and Persephone exchanged another conspiratorial glance. We'll hire the best lawyers and contest the will, Persephone said resolutely. We'll prove that Dad made it under duress or while he was mentally incompetent. You have no proof of duress. We'll find it, Everett promised grimly. We'll definitely find it. We'll check all of Dad's medical records for the last year, talk to the doctors, and examine his financial transactions. If you somehow coerced him into changing his will, we'll find out. In the meantime, we demand that you leave Dad's property alone. Persephone added, don't sell the house, don't dispose of the money, don't interfere in the company's affairs. I will dispose of my inheritance as I see fit, I replied firmly. It's my legal right. Your inheritance, Persephone snorted. You don't even understand what you've received. The construction company that Grandpa spent half a century building, the house where 3 generations of the Braxton family grew up, the money Dad saved his whole life for his children. For his children who only came into his life for the money, I reminded her. Clarence saved money to provide for his old age with his beloved wife, and he achieved that. Everett came up close to me, and I saw real hatred in his eyes. You think you've won? You think you can just take everything and live happily ever after? His voice became quiet and threatening. You're very much mistaken. We'll make your life unbearable. We'll tell the whole town what you're really like. A gold digger who bewitched a sick old man. Say what you want, I said calmly. The people who knew your father and me know the truth about our relationship. We'll see, Persephone muttered ominously. We'll see how long you last in this town when everyone finds out that you stole the inheritance from the deceased's children. They gathered their things and headed for the exit. At the door, Everett turned around. "This isn't the end, Cordelia." Not even close. The door slammed shut, and I was left alone in the house that now belonged to me by law, but felt like a battlefield. I knew that a long and brutal war lay ahead with people who would never forgive me for their father choosing me over them. But I also knew that Clarence knew his children better than they thought. He saw their true nature and made a decision that was perhaps the only way to teach them a lesson about what true love and devotion are. I sat in his chair where Persephone had sat that morning, planning my surrender, and thought about how my husband had protected me even after his death. Now it was my turn to protect his last will from those who never understood his true values. The days following the funeral turned into a real ordeal. Everett and Persephone launched a campaign against me, using every acquaintance and relative they could find. They did not attack openly. That would have been too obvious and could have backfired on them. Instead, they acted subtly, spreading rumors and doubts, causing people to question the fairness of the will. The first call came on Tuesday morning. Mrs. Thornberry, a distant relative of Clarence's through his first wife, called under the pretext of offering her condolences. "Cordelia, dear, I am so sorry for your loss," she began sympathetically. "Clarence was a wonderful man." "Thank you, Mrs. Thornberry. This is a very difficult time." "Of course, dear, and I understand that you have many difficult decisions to make right now." Her voice took on a cautious tone. "Everett told me about the will. What a surprise for all of us." "It was a surprise to me, too," I replied honestly. I understand. You must feel awkward receiving so much. After all, Clarence's children are left with nothing, poor things." Mrs. Thornberry spoke softly, but every word hit its mark, especially considering that this house has always belonged to the Braxton family. There are so many family memories, photographs, their mother's things, their mother's things. I never threw away or hid anything that belonged to Elizabeth. Her photographs were on the shelves, her books were in the library, her china set was used on holidays. Clarence wanted to preserve the memory of his first wife, and I respected that. "Mrs. Thornberry, Clarence made the decision about the will himself," I said cautiously. "Oh, yes, of course, dear. No one doubts that." The pause was eloquent. "It's just, well, you know how people talk. That older men sometimes make decisions based on their emotions, especially when they are ill and dependent on the care of a young wife. A young wife. I was 65, and she was over 70, but in her words, I sounded like a young gold digger. "I think it would be noble of you to think of Clarence's children," Mrs. Thornberry continued. "Perhaps share the inheritance, or at least leave them the house and the family business. You're young. You can start a new life somewhere else." After my conversation with Mrs. Thornberry, the calls began to come in regularly. Persephone's maternal uncle called to discuss the situation. Clarence's cousin came by in person to have a heart-to-heart talk. Old friends of the family called with cautious hints that the children should get their fair share. Each conversation was masterfully constructed. No one accused me directly. No one demanded anything openly. But they all suggested the same idea. I had received something that did not belong to me, and I had to correct this injustice myself. I spent Wednesday morning at Guilford Renwick's office discussing the details of inheriting the estate. The lawyer explained the procedures, the documents that needed to be completed, and the taxes that would have to be paid. Everything was legal and correct, but I saw concern in his eyes. "Mrs. Braxton," he said, closing the folder with the documents, "I must warn you. Everett and Persephone have already contacted a law firm in the state capital, a very expensive and influential firm. Are they seriously going to contest the will?" "More than seriously. They've hired a private investigator who is looking into your husband's medical records for the past year. They're looking for any evidence that his mind was clouded by illness or medication. But you have a statement from Dr. Wilkins saying that Clarence was competent. Yes, I do. But they can find other doctors who will give a different opinion, or they can question Dr. Wilkins' competence. Guilford Renwick took off his glasses and wiped them with a napkin. Besides, they're spreading rumors that you forced your husband to change his will. What rumors? That you threatened to divorce him if he didn't leave you an inheritance, that you controlled his communication with the children, that you isolated him from his family and friends. The lawyer spoke reluctantly, but I understood that I needed to know what I was up against. Threatened him with divorce. In 20 years of marriage, I had never once mentioned divorce, even in jest. Isolated him from his family. I always encouraged Clarence to communicate with the children, even when they behaved tactlessly. Mr. Renwick, how can I defend myself against slander? So far, it's just rumors, but if they start spreading false accusations publicly, we can sue them for defamation. He put his glasses back on and looked at me seriously. The main thing now is not to give in to provocation. Behave with dignity. Don't respond to rumors. Don't get into conflicts. On Wednesday evening, as I was watering the flowers in the garden, my neighbor Mrs. Wilson peered over the fence. We had lived next door to each other for 15 years and had always been friendly. Clarence helped her with home repairs, and I shared vegetables from my garden. Cordelia, how are you? She asked, but I heard tension in her voice. I'm getting by, thank you, Mrs. Wilson. That's good. She paused, choosing her words. Listen, I don't want to pry, but people are saying things about Clarence's will. What kind of things? Well, that the children were left without an inheritance, that it's somehow wrong. Mrs. Wilson was clearly uncomfortable. Persephone came to see me yesterday. She was crying, saying she didn't know how to explain to her children that their grandfather had left the house to a strange woman. A strange woman. After 20 years of being neighbors, I had become a strange woman. Mrs. Wilson, I said calmly, Clarence made his own decision. He knew what he was doing. Of course, of course. She nodded too quickly. Just, maybe it would be worth considering a compromise for the sake of family harmony. Family harmony. It was amazing how everyone cared about family harmony when it came to money. But no one cared about family harmony when Clarence's children ignored their father for years. On Thursday morning, I went to the grocery store and felt eyes on me. People whispered, pointed at me, turned away when I tried to say hello. The cashier, who had known me for years, was emphatically polite but cold. Standing in line behind me was Mrs. McLean, the wife of the pastor who had married Clarence and me. Cordelia, she said quietly, my husband would like to talk to you about Christian duty and forgiveness. Christian duty. So my Christian duty was to give my inheritance to stepchildren who had hated me for 20 years. Tell the pastor I'm ready to talk to him, I replied. Anytime. But Pastor McLean didn't come. Instead, unexpected support arrived. On Thursday evening, Mrs. Caldwell, the widow of Clarence's best friend, rang the doorbell. She brought a casserole and a bottle of wine. I thought you might not feel like cooking right now, she said, entering the house without an invitation, or being alone either. We sat down in the kitchen and Mrs. Caldwell poured the wine. Cordelia, she said bluntly, I know what people are saying, and I know it's complete nonsense. Thank you, but no, listen to me. She raised her hand to stop my objections. My husband was friends with Clarence for 40 years. I saw how he suffered after Elizabeth died, and I saw how he blossomed when he met you. Mrs. Caldwell took a sip of wine and continued. Clarence often talked to George about his children, about how disappointed he was in them, how they only came around for money and then disappeared for months. He said that if it weren't for you, he would have died of loneliness years ago. He never told me those things because he didn't want to upset you. Men don't like to complain to their wives about their children. She smiled sadly, but he could tell George the truth. And the truth was that his children had become strangers to him, greedy, selfish, ungrateful. On Friday morning, Dr. Wilkins, Clarence's family doctor, called. "Mrs. Braxton," he said with concern, "your husband's children's lawyers have contacted me. They are demanding copies of Clarence's medical records. They claim that he may have been incompetent when he made his will." "And what did you tell them?" "That it was complete nonsense. Clarence was of sound mind until the very end. Yes, he had heart problems, but that had no effect on his ability to make decisions," Dr. Wilkins said irritably. "What's more, when he came to see me for an examination before making his will, I specifically checked his mental state. All the tests showed that he was completely normal. So their attempts are doomed to failure? Not necessarily. They may find doctors who will give a different opinion based on the same data. Medicine is not an exact science, especially when it comes to the mental state of elderly people." On Saturday morning, Mr. Harrington, a neighbor who sat next to me at the funeral, came to see me. "Cordelia, I've heard rumors," he said without preamble. "Stupid, malicious rumors that you allegedly forced Clarence to change his will." "Mr. Harrington, let me finish." The old man sat down in Clarence's chair and looked at me seriously. "I lived across the street from your house for 20 years. I saw how Clarence cared for you, how you cared for him. I saw how rarely his children visited and how upset he was after they left." Mr. Harrington leaned forward. "If necessary, I will testify in court. I'll tell them what I saw, how you took Clarence to the doctors, how you sat with him at night when he was sick, and his children. Everett was last here in March. He stood on the porch for 5 minutes, took a check from his father, and left. Support came from other unexpected people as well. Clarence's secretary from the office called to say that her boss often talked about how happy he was with his new wife. The mechanic from the auto shop who serviced our cars said that Clarence always spoke proudly of me as his better half. But the most significant support came from the person I least expected to see. On Sunday evening, the doorbell rang, and there stood Mrs. Richardson, the younger sister of Clarence's first wife. She was an elegant woman in her 60s who had always been cool toward me. "Cordelia," she said as she entered the house, "I need to talk to you." We sat down in the living room, and Mrs. Richardson took an envelope out of her purse. "This is a letter from my sister Elizabeth. She wrote it before she died and asked me to give it to you if anything happened to Clarence." I took the envelope with trembling hands. A letter from my husband's first wife, written 20 years ago. "Read it," Mrs. Richardson said softly, "and you'll understand that even Elizabeth would want Clarence to be happy with you." I read Elizabeth's letter for a long time, rereading each line several times. The handwriting was weak and uneven. It was clear that the woman had written it in the last days of her life, when her strength was already failing her. But the words were clear and sincere. "Dear future wife of my Clarence," the letter began, "I don't know who you are or when you will appear in his life. Maybe in a year, maybe in 10 years. But I know you will appear because Clarence is not meant to be alone. He is a man who needs a family, care, and the warmth of a home. I give you my blessing to love him and ask you to make him happy. He deserves it more than anyone else in the world. And if my children oppose your happiness, know that it is not their mother's will. I want laughter to fill our house again after I'm gone, so that Clarence doesn't spend the rest of his days in sadness and loneliness. Be a good wife to him, as I can no longer be. Elizabeth." I folded the letter and looked at Mrs. Richardson, who was patiently waiting for my reaction. "Why didn't you give me this letter earlier?" I asked. "20 years ago, when I married Clarence?" "Because I wasn't ready to give it to you then," Mrs. Richardson replied honestly. "Elizabeth was my only sister, and it hurt me to see another woman replace her in the home we considered our family nest. But the years passed, and I saw what kind of wife you were to Clarence." "What kind of wife was I?" "Devoted, caring, loving." Mrs. Richardson spoke slowly, choosing each word carefully. "You did what Elizabeth asked in her letter. You made Clarence happy, and his children. They never forgave their father for being able to love again." "So you support the will?" "Completely." She stood up and walked toward the door. Clarence made the right decision. Everett and Persephone received much more money from him over the years than most children receive in a lifetime, but they never learned to appreciate their father's love. After Mrs. Richardson left, I sat in silence for a long time, thinking about what had happened. A week after the funeral, the situation became clear. The town was divided into two camps: those who knew Clarence and me personally, who saw our relationship from the inside, supported me. Those who knew us superficially or succumbed to rumors considered the will unfair. Monday brought a new wave of pressure. Everett arrived in the morning with an official letter from the law firm representing their interests. The document was written in a threatening tone and demanded that I voluntarily reconsider my position on the inheritance in the interests of fairness and family harmony. "Cordelia," Everett said, standing at my door in an expensive suit and designer sunglasses, "this is the last offer for an amicable settlement. If you agree to transfer the house and business to us, we will not contest your right to the bank accounts and insurance. And if I don't agree, then we will file a lawsuit to have the will declared invalid, and believe me, we have a good chance of success." He took off his sunglasses and looked at me with cold eyes. "We found a psychiatrist who is willing to testify that Dad may have been suffering from early-stage age-related dementia." "Based on what?" "On the fact that in the last months of his life, he was taking several types of medication that could have affected his mental clarity, plus his age, the stress of his illness, and his isolation from his children." Everett spoke like a lawyer, listing his arguments, enough to raise reasonable doubts about his mental capacity. "Your father was perfectly sane until the day he died." "That's your opinion. A professional's opinion may be different." He paused, giving me time to think about what he had said. "In addition, we have witnesses who can testify that you controlled his communication with the family, prevented our visits, and created an atmosphere of alienation." "What witnesses?" "People who saw how you reacted to our visits, how you rushed to end conversations when we discussed family matters, how you made it clear to Dad that our presence was unpleasant for you. It was a distortion of reality, but a skillful one. Yes, I wasn't happy about their visits because I knew they would upset Clarence with their requests for money. Yes, I tried to cut short unpleasant conversations because I saw how they affected my husband's health. But now my defense of Clarence was seen as manipulation and isolation." "You have 24 hours to think about it," Everett said, putting his glasses back on. "After that, we'll file a lawsuit." He left, leaving me alone with a difficult choice. I could agree to their demands, avoid a trial, and get at least part of the inheritance, or I could fight for Clarence's will, risking losing everything in a long and expensive process. That evening, I went to the cemetery. Clarence's grave had not yet been decorated, just a simple wooden cross with his name and dates of birth and death. The flowers that people had brought were beginning to wilt, and the place looked neglected. I sat down on the folding chair I had brought with me and spoke to my husband as if he could hear me. "Clarence, I don't know what to do. Your children have declared war on me, and I'm not sure I can win. Maybe you shouldn't have left me your entire inheritance. Maybe it would have been better to divide everything equally and avoid this battle. The wind rustled the leaves of the old oak tree under which my husband lay. I closed my eyes and tried to remember his voice, his advice in difficult situations. Clarence always told me, Cordelia, don't back down when you know you're right. Principles are more important than peace of mind. When I opened my eyes, an elderly woman with a bouquet of white roses was standing next to the grave. I didn't know her, but she approached me with a friendly smile. I'm sorry to interrupt your solitude, she said softly. I'm Mrs. Pendleton. Clarence built a house for my daughter 10 years ago. It's nice to meet you. I wanted to bring flowers to the grave of a good man, Mrs. Pendleton continued, placing the roses by the cross, and to tell you that not everyone in town supports this campaign against you. Thank you. That means a lot to me. Clarence often talked about you when he worked for my daughter. He told me what a wonderful wife you were, how you took care of him, how you made the house cozy. Mrs. Pendleton sat down on the grass next to my chair. As for the children, he spoke little and reluctantly. It was clear that this was a painful subject. He loved them, but he was disappointed in them. You could see it in his face when someone asked about his son and daughter. He answered briefly and quickly changed the subject. The elderly woman shook her head. It's sad when children become a source of pain for their parents. We sat in silence for a few minutes, each thinking our own thoughts. Then Mrs. Pendleton stood up and put her hand on my shoulder. Hang in there, dear. The truth always wins, although sometimes it takes time. That evening, I made a decision. I called Guilford Renwick at home and said, Mr. Renwick, I'm ready to fight. Clarence's will must be carried out exactly as he wanted. Are you sure? The process will be difficult and painful. I'm sure if I back down now, I will betray my husband's memory and show his children that coercion works. The next day, I started a new life. The first thing I did was change the locks on the house. If Everett and Persephone want to come in, let them ring the doorbell like guests. Then I went to the construction company's office and introduced myself to the employees as the new owner. The craftsmen and engineers who had worked with Clarence for years greeted me with respect. They knew that I was not just the boss's wife, but a person who understood his business and supported his decisions. Mrs. Braxton, said Foreman Tom Anderson, Mr. Clarence often told us that if anything happened to him, we could count on your support, that you wouldn't abandon the company. I won't, I assured him. We will continue to work as well as we did under Clarence. At the bank, I had to deal with bureaucracy and skepticism. The manager, who knew Clarence personally, cautiously hinted that the bank was concerned about the stability of the accounts in the context of a family dispute. Mr. Davidson, I said firmly, the will is legally binding, and I have every right to dispose of the funds. If the bank creates obstacles, I will transfer the accounts to another bank. He quickly changed his tone and assured me of his full cooperation. The most difficult thing was to announce the breakup of my relationship with my stepsons. I wrote them a letter through my lawyer, clearly stating my position. Everett and Persephone, in 20 years, you have never once recognized me as a member of the family. Now that your father is gone, we have no reason to maintain any relationship. I will carry out Clarence's last will and defend it in court. I will no longer tolerate your attempts at intimidation and blackmail. Cordelia Braxton. Their response came 3 days later in the form of a lawsuit to invalidate the will. The war had officially begun, but I no longer felt fear or uncertainty. Elizabeth's letter, the support of true friends, and the memory of Clarence's love gave me strength. I realized that I was starting a new chapter in my life, without the toxic people who had poisoned my existence for years, without trying to please those who never appreciated my efforts. The house became quieter, but it was a healthy silence, the silence of peace, not tension. I could finally live the way I wanted without looking back at the opinions of people who never loved me. Clarence gave me more than just an inheritance. He gave me the freedom to be myself,